Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going deep into the fascinating world where neuroscience and language collide. We've got a research paper that suggests our brains might learn language in a totally different way than we thought, even different from how AI like ChatGPT does it.
Yes, it's a paper called Hebbian Learning and the Local Structure of Language. It suggests that our brains learn language locally and without any supervision.
Local and unsupervised. Okay, those are some interesting terms, but I'm going to need some help understanding what that means. How does that work in the brain?
Well, imagine that each neuron in your brain is like a little detective.
A little detective, okay.
Yeah, and they're only connected to a small group of their neighbors. That's what local means.
Okay.
And these detectives, they try to figure out language just by watching how their neighbors react to words and sentences. They don't have any instruction manual or anything. That's what unsupervised means.
So these neuron detectives are like forming their own theories about language just by watching their neighbors?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. That almost sounds like how Nicaraguan Sign Language NSL developed, right?
That's a great connection. NSL emerged in the 1970s among deaf children, and they basically built a language from scratch without any pre-existing model. This challenges the idea that language learning is all about absorbing massive amounts of data.
That's amazing. But if our brains are learning language this way, how can we explain the complex structures of language? Like, how do we get grammar? And how is all of this different from the way those big language models, the LLMs, learn?
That's the big question. The paper suggests a principle called Hebbian learning might be the key. It boils down to neurons that fire together, wire together.
So the more these neuron detectives encounter a certain pattern in language, the stronger their connection becomes, and the better they get at recognizing it.
Exactly. It's like, think of a path in the woods. It becomes a well-worn trail the more people walk it.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah, and the paper proposes a model where these neurons are arranged in a hierarchy. They start with simple two-letter combinations, like TEC or key.
So it's like building a tower from the bottom up. First the letters, then bigger chunks, and eventually sentences.
Exactly.
Yo.
And what's interesting is that the model uses a process similar to byte pair encoding in computer science,
Okay.
but with a crucial difference. Each new unit has to be built from units learned at a lower level.
So you can't have a three-letter combination unless it's made from two-letter combinations that the brain already knows.
Yeah, that's right. The paper calls this a smooth token set.
A smooth token set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a key part of their model.
Okay, so we've got these little detectives learning locally and unsupervised, building up language piece by piece. But there has to be a limit, right? I mean, our brains can't just keep adding more and more complex chunks of language forever.
That's a really good point, and the paper actually addresses that. It suggests that at some point, the complexity just becomes unsustainable and the hierarchy collapses.
Wait, so the model actually predicts that our brains have a built-in limit for how complex language can get. Is that why we don't have words that are like a million letters long?
That's one of the paper's key insights. This limit on complexity might be why human languages have, finite word lengths. Our brains have a natural ceiling for complexity.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still thinking about NSL. If this model is all about learning from language data, how can it explain a language that seemingly just popped up out of nowhere?
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. So the researchers decided to train their model on random strings of letters.
So like just feeding the model a bunch of gibberish.
Yeah, exactly. And get this.
Yeah.
The model, it spontaneously developed structures that were incredibly similar to the structures found in real human languages.
You're kidding. It like created its own grammar, its own set of rules for language.
Exactly. Just from those random letters.
Yeah.
It showed a preference for certain letter combinations and word lengths, similar to what linguists call morphology, the way words are formed.
Wow.
The researchers think this might be a fundamental tendency that arises from the structure of our brains, not just the languages we're exposed to.
So the building blocks of language might not be arbitrary after all. They could be ingrained in the way our brains are wired.
That's what the research suggests. It hints at a deep connection between our brain structure and the very nature of language itself.
Wow, that's incredible. But how does this model go from recognizing patterns in letters to actually understanding what words mean? I mean, we don't just see a string of letters and think, oh, that's a cat. We see a cat and instantly know what it is.
That's where the concept of replay comes in.
Replay, like hitting rewind on a movie.
Sort of.
Mhm.
In the model, replay is when the brain revisits those hierarchical structures that we talked about, those bigograms, trigrams, and
Just
saurons.
like going back and reviewing the notes from the
Yeah,
case.
exactly. And during replay, another set of neurons come into play. They're called auxiliary neurons, and they learn what are called embeddings, which are basically abstract representations of entire words.
Hold on, embeddings. That sounds familiar. Didn't we talk about those earlier?
We did, but back then we were talking about embeddings of individual words.
Hmm.
These are different. Think of them like super embeddings.
Okay.
They're representing entire concepts or ideas, not just single words.
Okay, so it's like the brain has a mental dictionary, but instead of just definitions, it stores this whole network of related concepts. Like for apple, you'd have fruit, sweet, red, and all these other connections.
You got it. These super embeddings allow the brain to, like, make connections between different words and concepts,
Yeah.
creating this web of meaning. It's like having a mental map of language where everything is interconnected.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do these auxiliary neurons learn these super embeddings? It seems like a pretty big job.
It is. And that's where things get even more interesting. They learn through a process called replay relearning.
Replay, relearn. Okay, now you're just making up words. Tell me more.
Imagine you're reading a book and you come across a word you've never seen before. What do you do?
I'd probably try to figure out what it means based on the other words around it, the context.
Exactly. And that's essentially what replay relearning is all about. In the model, when the brain encounters a new concept, it activates a random auxiliary neuron.
Wait, so it just picks a neuron out of a hat and says, you're in charge of this new concept.
Pretty much. And
Oh.
from that point on, that neuron becomes associated with, all the features and connections related to that concept.
But wouldn't that get messy? If it's randomly assigning neurons to new concepts, wouldn't the brain eventually run out of neurons or just create this chaotic jumble?
That's where the brilliance of this model shines. The researchers propose a mechanism called compression.
Compression, like zipping a file on a computer to make it smaller.
It's a similar concept. Through compression, the brain streamlines all the information stored in those auxiliary neurons.
So it finds a way to, like, pack more information into a smaller space, like a super efficient filing system.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
this compression happens by taking advantage of the fact that different concepts often share common features, like apple and orange both have the feature fruit.
Right, so by grouping those shared features, the brain can create a more efficient way to represent meaning. That's amazing.
It is. And this compression process, it not only saves space, but it also allows for continual learning without forgetting.
So it's a win-win, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around how all of this actually plays out in, real-world language processing. How does it explain the way we speak and understand each other in everyday conversations?
That's a great question. The researchers suggest that the key is the interaction between those tokenizing hierarchies we talked about earlier and the auxiliary neurons with their super embeddings.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. The hierarchies handle the basic building blocks, and then the auxiliary neurons provide the context and meaning.
Exactly. Together, they create this system that can both, decode the structure of language and extract its meaning.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit, it's getting a bit abstract. Can you give me a concrete example of how this might work in practice?
Sure. Imagine you hear the sentence, "The cat sat on the mat." How do you think your brain processes that?
Well, I guess it first recognizes the individual words. The cat sat on the mat.
Right. And that's where those tokenizing hierarchies come in. They've learned to recognize these common word patterns.
But how does the brain know that the cat is the subject of the sentence and sat on the mat is what the cat is doing?
That's where those auxiliary neurons and their embeddings play a crucial role. The neuron associated with the concept of cat might be linked to other embeddings like animal, feline, pet,
Uh-huh.
and the neuron for sat might be connected to action, position, rest.
So each word triggers this whole cascade of related concepts and meanings in the brain, like a chain reaction of understanding.
Exactly. And by combining all of these embeddings, the brain can build this much richer understanding of the sentence as a whole. It's not just recognizing words in isolation, but understanding the relationships between them.
That's amazing. But I'm wondering if this model is so powerful, couldn't it be used to create, like, more advanced AI systems?
That's a question a lot of researchers are asking right now. And the paper does hint at some intriguing possibilities.
Such as?
Well, for example, the concept of replay relearning could be used to develop AI systems that can learn new information more efficiently and flexibly.
So instead of needing to be trained on like mountains of data, they could learn more, like humans do, by interacting with the world and building connections between different concepts.
Exactly. And the idea of compression could lead to AI systems that are more compact and efficient.
So we could have AI that's not only smarter, but also smaller and faster. That would be revolutionary.
It's definitely a possibility. This research might also help us understand the limitations of current AI systems.
You mean like those large language models that sometimes generate text that makes no sense or is even offensive?
Yes, this model's emphasis on local and unsupervised learning suggests that the human brain might be doing something fundamentally different from how those LLMs are trained.
So the key to creating truly intelligent AI might lie in understanding how the brain learns without massive data sets and explicit instructions.
That's a very compelling idea, and it's one that's driving a lot of exciting research at the intersection of neuroscience and AI.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. But before we wrap things up for this part of our discussion, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. This idea that morphology, the way we form words, might actually be rooted in the structure of our brains.
Yes, the researchers found that even when trained on random data, their model exhibited a tendency to create words with certain patterns and structures, very similar to real human languages.
So are they saying that there are like universal principles of language that are hardwired into our brains, that we're all born with this blueprint for language?
It's a provocative question, and the paper doesn't give a definitive answer, but the findings definitely point in that direction.
And if that's true, it raises some pretty profound questions about the nature of human language and thought. Are we all born with an innate understanding of language? Is there a limit to the kinds of languages we can create and understand?
Those are questions that philosophers and linguists have been grappling with for centuries.
And now, thanks to neuroscience, we might be getting closer to some answers. This has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive. We'll be right back to continue our exploration of this groundbreaking research, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring this research that's really challenging our understanding of how the brain learns language.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From neuron detectives building their language theories to this idea that there's actually a limit to language complexity. But right before we went to break, we were talking about how the brain goes from simply recognizing words to actually understanding their meaning.
Right, we were discussing those auxiliary neurons with their super embeddings. It's a complex system, but it's how the researchers believe our brains are able to create this rich and interconnected network of meaning.
I have to say, when I first heard about these auxiliary neurons, it almost sounded like they were this like separate system tacked on to the main language processing hierarchy. Is that accurate, or am I like oversimplifying things?
That's a good question, and it touches on a really crucial point. Those auxiliary neurons aren't a completely separate system. They actually work in tandem with those tokenizing hierarchies that we talked about earlier. Think of it more like a collaboration.
Okay.
The hierarchies handle the nuts and bolts of language, breaking it down into those fundamental building blocks. And then the auxiliary neurons, they step in to provide the context and extract the deeper meaning.
So it's like having a team of experts working on a case. You've got the detectives gathering evidence, and then you have the analysts, piecing it all together to form a bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. The hierarchies are meticulously analyzing the structure of language, while the auxiliary neurons are weaving together a tapestry of meaning from those individual threads.
That makes a lot of sense, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how this all works in practice. Could you maybe walk me through a concrete example? Let's say I hear the sentence, "The dog chased the ball." What's happening in my brain, according to this model?
Okay, let's break it down. First, your brain, thanks to those tokenizing hierarchies, rapidly identifies the individual words. The dog chased the ball. It's like those detectives quickly recognizing familiar faces in a lineup.
Okay, so the words have been identified, but how does my brain understand who's doing what to whom? How does it know the dog is the one doing the chasing and the ball is the thing being chased?
That's where the auxiliary neurons with their super embeddings really come into play. Imagine that the neuron associated with the concept of dog is connected to a whole web of other embeddings, things like animal, four-legged, pet, chases.
And the neuron for chased would be linked to concepts like action, movement, pursuit.
Exactly. So each word triggers this cascade of associated concepts and meanings in the brain. It's like each word is a key that unlocks a treasure chest of related information.
And by combining all those embeddings, the brain can piece together this much more complete understanding of the sentence. So it's not just understanding individual words, but the relationships between them.
Precisely. This model explains how we can understand complex sentences and even infer meaning that isn't explicitly stated, like it's like reading between the lines, connecting the dots.
That's incredible. But I can't help but wonder if this model is so good at explaining how the brain processes language. What does it tell us about the differences between the human brain and artificial intelligence? Could this research lead to more human-like AI?
That's a question that's generated a lot of excitement in the field. And this paper does offer some tantalizing hints. For instance, the concept of replay relearning. It could be really crucial for developing AI systems that learn more like humans do.
So instead of needing to be trained on massive data sets, these AI systems could learn by interacting with the world and building connections between different concepts, just like our neuron detectives.
That's the idea. And the concept of compression could be equally important. It suggests that we might be able to build AI systems that are more compact and efficient, just like the human brain.
So we could have AI that's not only smarter, but also smaller and faster. That would be a game changer.
It's certainly a possibility. This research could also help us understand why current AI systems sometimes struggle. Those large language models, they often generate text that's nonsensical or even offensive. This model suggests that the brain's approach to language learning, with its focus on local, unsupervised learning, might be fundamentally different.
So the key to building truly intelligent AI might lie in understanding how the brain learns without needing massive data sets and explicit instructions.
That's a fascinating possibility and one that researchers are actively exploring. But there's another intriguing angle to this research, and it has to do with the evolution of language itself.
Oh, I'm all ears.
Well, if this model is correct, and our brains have this built-in mechanism for learning language, locally and unsupervised, it suggests that there might be these universal principles of language, like embedded in our neural circuitry.
So it's like we're all born with this language instinct, a blueprint for grammar and syntax that's hardwired into our brains.
That's a very compelling idea.
Oh.
And if it's true, it would explain why we can learn new languages, even ones that are vastly different from our native tongue. It would mean that at some deep level, all human languages share this common underlying structure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it also raises the question of whether there are limits to the kinds of languages we can create and understand. Could there be a language out there somewhere in the universe that's so fundamentally different from our own that our brains simply couldn't grasp it?
That's a truly thought-provoking question,
Yeah.
and one that this research might help us to answer. If our brains are wired for certain types of linguistic structures, it stands to reason that there might be structures that are simply beyond our cognitive reach.
Wow. That's mind-bending. Okay, I need a moment to process all of that. But before we wander too far into the realm of science fiction, let's bring it back to the research paper for a moment. We've talked a lot about the model itself, but I'm curious about the researchers' methods. Like,
Yeah.
how did they actually test these ideas?
They use this clever combination of computational modeling and analysis of real-world language data. Essentially, they built a computer simulation of their model, and then they compared its output to actual human languages.
So they created like a virtual brain, trained it on language data, and then saw if it produced anything that resembled real human language.
Exactly. And what they found was remarkable. Even when they trained their model on random strings of letters, it spontaneously developed structures that mirrored those found in real languages.
You're kidding. So like it created its own grammar, its own set of rules for language without ever being exposed to a real language.
Precisely. And those rules reflected some of the fundamental principles of human language, like the tendency for words to be composed of smaller recurring units.
It's like the model like rediscovered the concept of morphology all on its own. That's incredible.
It is. And it provides really strong support for the idea that these principles of language, they might be inherent to the way our brains are structured.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, I'm still struggling to picture how this model like connects to the physical structure of the brain. We've been talking about neurons and connections and all that, but where are all these structures actually located?
That's a great question. The researchers suggest that those tokenizing hierarchies, the ones that are breaking down language into its building blocks, they might be located in areas of the brain associated with sensory processing and motor control.
So the parts of the brain responsible for, like, hearing and producing sounds, that makes sense.
It does. And those auxiliary neurons, the ones with the super embeddings, they might be located in areas associated with higher level cognitive functions like memory and language comprehension.
So it's like this distributed system with different parts of the brain working together to process language, each part contributing its own expertise.
Exactly. And the researchers believe that studying the interactions between these different brain regions could unlock even more secrets about the neural code of language.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place. But if we can map these language processing areas in the brain, does that mean we could one day, like, read someone's thoughts? I mean, it's a bit of a sci-fi scenario, but it's a question that always pops up when we talk about the brain and language.
It's a question that captures the imagination for sure. And while the progress being made in neuroscience is remarkable, we're still a long way from, mind-reading devices. Language processing is incredibly complex, and even if we can pinpoint the areas of the brain involved, decoding the neural activity into coherent thoughts is a monumental challenge.
So no mind-reading devices anytime soon. Bummer. But but seriously, it's both fascinating and a bit reassuring to know that our thoughts are still our own, at least for now.
Absolutely. The brain is the ultimate black box, and we've
Yeah.
only just begun to scratch the surface of its mysteries.
That's a great point to end on. This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive into the world of neuroscience and language. We've explored this groundbreaking research paper, unpacked complex concepts, and even pondered the philosophical implications of these findings. It's been a wild ride.
It has, and it highlights just how much we still have to learn about the brain and its remarkable capacity for language.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We encourage you to stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop asking questions. Until next time, this is The Deep Dive signing off. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been on this incredible journey exploring how our brains might be learning and processing language in a way that's, like, totally different from what we previously thought.
Yeah, we've been unpacking this fascinating model that suggests our brains might have um, this built-in system for language, a system that relies on those local connections and unsupervised learning. It's a pretty radical departure from that traditional view that language is primarily learned through, imitation and memorization.
Yeah, it is. We've talked about those neuron detectives building their own theories about language, those hierarchical structures that limit complexity, and even the idea that there might be these universal principles of language embedded in our brains. It's mind-blowing stuff.
It is. And what's even more exciting is that this research, it isn't just theoretical. It actually has the potential to unlock a deeper understanding of, uh, of language disorders
Hmm.
and maybe even revolutionize artificial intelligence.
Exactly. We touched on the AI part earlier, but let's talk about the implications for language disorders. If this model is accurate, it could completely change how we approach conditions like aphasia or dyslexia.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to pinpoint the specific neural mechanisms that are disrupted in these disorders. It could lead to, more targeted and effective therapies.
Yeah, it'd be incredible to help someone regain their ability to speak after a stroke, or give a child the tools they need to overcome reading difficulties. This research could be life-changing for so many people.
It really could. And beyond its clinical applications, this research also kind of forces us to rethink some fundamental questions about the nature of language itself.
Okay, let's dive into that. What kind of questions are we talking about?
Well, if the brain is learning language locally and without supervision, does that mean there's like a universal grammar hardwired into our neural circuitry? Are,
Hmm.
are we all born with a blueprint for language, so to speak?
So, like, a set of fundamental rules that govern all human languages, regardless of their surface differences. It's a fascinating idea.
It is. And if it's true, it would explain why we can learn new languages, even ones that are vastly different from our native tongue. It would mean that at some deep level, all human languages share this common underlying structure.
That makes sense, but it also raises the question of whether there are, like, limits to the kinds of languages we can create and understand. Could there be a language out there somewhere in the universe that's so fundamentally different from our own that our brains simply couldn't grasp it?
That's a truly thought-provoking question, and one that this research might help us to answer. If our brains are wired for certain types of linguistic structures, it stands to reason that there might be structures that are simply beyond our cognitive reach.
Wow, that's mind-bending. Okay, I need a moment to process all of that. But before we wander too far into the realm of science fiction, let's bring it back to the research paper for a moment. We've talked a lot about the model itself, but I'm curious about the researchers' methods. Like, how did they actually uh, test these ideas?
Well, they used this clever combination of computational modeling and analysis of real-world language data. Essentially, they built a computer simulation of their model and then compared its output to actual human languages.
So they created like a virtual brain, trained it on language data, and then saw if it produced anything that resembled real human language.
Exactly. And what they found was pretty remarkable. Even when they trained their model on random strings of letters, it spontaneously developed structures that mirrored those found in real
Ain't
languages.
kidding. So like it created its own grammar, its own set of rules for language without ever being exposed to a real language.
Precisely. And those rules, they reflected some of the fundamental principles of human language, like the tendency for words to be composed of smaller recurring units.
It's like the model rediscovered the concept of morphology all on its own. That's incredible.
It is, and it provides really strong support for the idea that these principles of language might be inherent to the way our brains are structured.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit I'm still struggling to picture how this model like connects to the physical structure of the brain. We've been talking about neurons and connections and all that, but where are all these structures actually located?
That's a great question. The researchers suggest that those tokenizing hierarchies, the ones that are breaking down language into its building blocks, they might be located in areas of the brain associated with sensory processing and motor control.
So the parts of the brain responsible for like hearing and producing sounds, that makes sense.
It does. And those auxiliary neurons, the ones with the super embeddings, they might be located in areas associated with higher level cognitive functions, like memory and language comprehension.
So it's like this distributed system with different parts of the brain working together to process language, each part contributing its own expertise.
Exactly. And the researchers believe that studying the interactions between these different brain regions could unlock even more secrets about the neural code of language.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place. But if we can map these language processing areas in the brain, it's a bit of a sci-fi scenario, but it's a question that always pops up when we talk about the brain and language.
It's a question that captures the imagination for sure. And while the progress being made in neuroscience is remarkable, we're still a long way from mind reading devices.
Mhm.
Language processing is incredibly complex, and even if we can pinpoint the areas of the brain involved, decoding that neural activity into coherent thoughts is a monumental challenge.
So no mind reading devices anytime soon. Bummer. But seriously, it's both fascinating and a bit reassuring to know that our thoughts are still our own, at least for now.
Absolutely. The brain is the ultimate black box, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of its mysteries. This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive into the world of neuroscience and language. We've explored a groundbreaking research paper, unpacked those complex concepts, and even pondered the philosophical implications of these findings. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and it just highlights how much we still have to learn about the brain and its remarkable capacity for language. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We encourage you to stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop asking questions. Until next time, this is the Deep Dive signing off.